My studio apartment in downtown Louisville, Kentucky, was supposed to be my sanctuary. For 48 years, Vivian Thorne had sought out quiet pockets in a noisy world, and this concrete building, a relic of dependable, brutalist architecture, promised exactly that. Its thick walls were legendary. You could hear the distant rumble of city buses on 4th Street, the faint echo of laughter from the nearby bars, but within my own four walls, a profound silence reigned. It was a haven I'd cultivated, a meticulously organized space where every book had its place, every cushion was plumped, and the only sounds were those I chose to make. I valued that peace above almost everything else. The building itself was a patchwork of lives, mostly blue-collar workers, single individuals like me, and small, struggling families. It was a low-income place, meaning a kaleidoscope of experiences converged within its sturdy frame. I was one of the long-term tenants, having lived there for years, observing the comings and goings, the subtle rhythms of apartment living. My life revolved around my quiet job in data analysis, where precision and attention to detail were paramount, a trait that spilled over into my personal life. I was observant by nature, noticing the smallest shifts, the quietest changes. This innate quality I would soon discover would become both my burden and my eventual weapon. Then came the guitar player. His name, I later learned, was Marcus. He lived in the studio apartment directly to my left, the one I'd always assumed was empty because of the impenetrable silence emanating from it. The first time I heard him, it wasn't an annoyance. It was late afternoon, a mellow Sunday, and I was reading by the window. A rich, soulful melody drifted through the wall, clear, complex, undeniably talented. I remember thinking, how lovely, a musician lives nearby. It was a fleeting thought, a gentle intrusion that felt more like a gift than a disturbance. I tucked that observation away, a small, pleasant detail in my otherwise predictable world, but the pleasantries quickly evaporated. A few nights later, around midnight, the soft melodies morphed into something louder, more insistent. It wasn't a gentle practice session anymore. It was a performance, a full-volume jam session that vibrated through the very floor beneath my feet. I tried to ignore it, pulling my pillow over my head, but the sound waves were relentless, thrumming against my eardrums. I could make out distinct chords, intricate solos, and the thud of a drum machine, all amplified to concert levels. Even with the legendary soundproofing of our concrete fortress, it was like his amplifier was plugged directly into my own electrical outlets. My stomach knotted with a familiar dread, a feeling I recognized from past minor disruptions, the kind that threatened to unravel my carefully constructed peace. I lay there listening, feeling a deep internal debate play out. Confrontation was not my strong suit. I preferred to observe, to understand, to avoid direct conflict. My guilt-ridden nature meant I always worried about offending, about being the cause of someone else's discomfort. But this was different. This was my sanctuary being invaded. At 3 o'clock in the morning, when the bass lines started thumping against my chest and the lead guitar wailed like a banshee, my resolve fractured. I threw on my bathrobe, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and ventured into the dimly lit hallway. The soundproofing was so effective that when I stepped outside my door, the music was suddenly deafening, reverberating off the concrete walls, making the air thrum. It felt like standing inside a massive, poorly tuned speaker. I could hear other doors opening and closing, muffled shouts, and the unmistakable sound of someone else banging on his door, their frustration palpable even through the noise. I had to wait for a rare, brief lull in the storm of sound before my knocking could even be heard. My knuckles were sore from the effort by the time a moment of relative quiet descended. The door creaked open, revealing Marcus. He was a man in his early 30s, I guessed, with disheveled dark hair and eyes that seemed perpetually wide, even in the dim hall light. He blinked at me, a flicker of surprise, then recognition. "Oh hey," he said, his voice hoarse, clearly surprised. "Vivian, right from next door?" "Yes," I managed, my voice a little shaky from the adrenaline. "Marcus, the music, it's quite loud, very loud, it's 3 in the morning." He looked genuinely contrite. "Oh man, I am so sorry. I didn't even realize I get, caught up." He ran a hand through his hair. "It won't happen again, promise, my apologies truly." His apology seemed sincere. I thanked him, relief flooding through me, and retreated to my apartment. The silence, when it finally returned, was profound, almost deafening in its contrast. I climbed back into bed, feeling a fragile sense of victory. Perhaps it was a one-off, an accidental lapse. I spent the next day feeling a mild satisfaction, believing I had handled it reasonably, assertively, without being overly confrontational. My small world had been briefly disturbed, but now equilibrium had been restored. Or so I foolishly hoped. Little did I know that brief exchange was merely the overture to a symphony of chaos. Within a couple of weeks, the music returned. Not as intense at first, but creeping up in volume, slowly, insidiously. I'd be trying to read or watch the news, and the muffled thump 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 would start, gradually increasing until it became impossible to ignore. My steadfast nature meant I tried to ride it out to give him the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps he was just having a bad day or lost track of time. But the days stretched into nights, the intrusions becoming more frequent, more brazen. And then the flu hit. It wasn't just a cold. It was the kind of flu that cemented you to your mattress, that made your bones ache and your head throb with every pulse. I was too weak, too utterly miserable to even contemplate getting out of bed, let alone confronting my neighbor. The music started up again, loud and belligerent at an ungodly hour. I heard the familiar banging on his door, this time more furious, more desperate. I heard shouts, muffled by the concrete but unmistakable in their anger. My dishes rattled in the cupboard, a small metallic symphony of frustration mirroring my own. I could do nothing but pull the covers tighter, wishing the world away, and eventually delirium dragged me back to sleep. The next night at 2 in the morning it happened. Not a full-blown concert, not a complex melody. Just one single, sustained electric guitar note. B-R-A-A. It was a high, thin wail, unwavering, endless. It pierced through the walls, through my skull, vibrating in my very teeth. It held like a taut, invisible wire for 10 excruciating minutes. My entire apartment seemed to hum with that single, maddening sound. It was an act of pure, unadulterated psychological torture. It was deliberate. It was malicious. Still, I was too sick to react, trapped in my bed, burning with fever. And then the door pounding started again, even more frantic, accompanied by guttural roars of frustration. I didn't hear Marcus answer. I heard the frustrated footsteps retreat, the angry slam of another door down the hall. My mind, clouded by illness, dimly wondered if he thought it was me, if he was specifically targeting me. The thought was chilling, a cold tendril of fear snaking around my already miserable body. The next morning the flu haze had lifted just enough for me to shuffle out of bed and make some weak tea. As I opened my door to retrieve the newspaper, I saw it. Coiled neatly on my welcome mat, directly in front of my door, was a broken guitar string. It was small, metallic, and deadly in its symbolism. It was a clear fuck you, an unmistakable message. And it sat there, a chilling, personal threat, right at the threshold of my solitary home. My stomach plummeted. This wasn't just about loud music anymore. This was a direct, pointed act of aggression. I was no longer just annoyed, I was afraid. My quiet haven was no longer safe, my resolve solidified. I would have to act even if my guilt-ridden nature recoiled from confrontation. This escalating madness could not continue. This was the quiet before the storm, the moment I understood that my life had fundamentally shifted. The peace I cherished, the safety I took for granted, was now under siege. And as the situation worsened, I knew I couldn't be the silent observer forever. I would need help, and I knew exactly where to look for support, right here on the Neighbours From Hell channel. Subscribe to Neighbours From Hell channel for new Neighbours From Hell stories daily. The thought was a strange comfort, a lifeline in the burgeoning chaos. The broken guitar string was merely the beginning, a grim promise of the malevolence to come. I tried to dismiss it as a twisted joke, a moment of drunken spite, but the unsettling feeling lingered, a cold knot in my stomach that tightened with each passing day. My observant nature, once a passive trait, transformed into an acute hypervigilance. Every creak in the hallway, every muffled sound from Marcus's apartment, sent a jolt of anxiety through me. My sanctuary had become a cage of apprehension. I started noticing other things. A faint, acrid smell of stale cigarette smoke that sometimes permeated the hallway near his door, despite the strict no-smoking policy. I also started seeing evidence of other disturbances, though I didn't connect them to Marcus at first. There would be strange, sticky splotches on the concrete walls, odd streaks of brown and white. Chili, I later realized, and baking powder. It was hurled, splattered, smeared, a grotesque mural of urban decay. I'd come home from work to find our long-suffering maintenance guy, a stoic man named Frank, scrubbing diligently, his face etched with weary resignation. He'd just shake his head, offer a grim half-smile, and continue his thankless task. My guilt churned within me. Why wasn't anyone doing anything more? Why was this allowed to persist? Then came the fire alarms. The first time, it was close to midnight. I was sound asleep when the piercing shriek tore through the silence, rattling my windows, jolting me upright in bed. My heart leaped into my throat, hammering against my ribs. Instinct took over. Fire. I fumbled for my slippers, threw on a coat, and joined the stream of bewildered, half-dressed residents pouring out of their apartments, eyes wide with fear and confusion. We stood shivering on the sidewalk for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the wail of fire trucks for the all-clear. When the firefighters finally arrived, they swept through the building, announced it was a false alarm, and left. A collective sigh of relief, followed by grumbles of annoyance, rippled through the crowd. I went back to my apartment, my nerves frayed, sleep utterly banished. A few nights later, it happened again just before dawn. The same ear-splitting shriek, the same panicked rush, the same cold weight on the pavement, the same frustrating conclusion. It was a false alarm. Again. It was then that the whispers started among the tenants. "It's that guy on the third floor," someone mumbled. "The musician." My stomach clenched. It was Marcus. This wasn't accidental. This was deliberate torment, a calculated assault on the peace and safety of every resident in the building. My frustration, which had been a slow burn, now flared into incandescent rage. My steadfast nature kicked in. I started documenting everything. I bought a small, discreet notebook and a reliable pen, marking down dates, times, specific sounds, visual evidence. I started taking photos with my phone discreetly, of course, of the smeared food, the stained walls, the general disarray that seemed to be an increasingly permanent fixture in our once pristine hallway. My internal monologue became a constant stream of questions. What is happening? Why isn't anyone stopping this? Is he mentally unwell? If so, why isn't he getting help? The guilt from my first, gentle confrontation returned, amplified by the thought that perhaps I had somehow contributed to his escalation. Was my polite request seen as an attack? The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday night. I was trying to relax, a cup of herbal tea steaming on my coffee table, the quiet hum of the city a soothing backdrop. Suddenly a crash echoed from the hallway, followed by a guttural roar filled with raw, unhinged fury. My tea sloshed onto my hand, scalding me. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. More crashes, closer this time, accompanied by a chilling, high-pitched scream. It was Marcus. His voice, distorted by rage and despair, was screaming about wanting to die, about smashing things, about people not understanding him. Then came the unmistakable sound of wood splintering, followed by a sickening thud, repeated over and over. He was smashing his guitar, and it sounded like it was happening right outside my door. My blood ran cold. My hands trembled, the teacup clattering back onto its saucer. Fear, stark and primal, seized me. This wasn't just noise anymore. This was violence. This was a man threatening himself and, by extension, threatening everyone else. I pictured him out there, raging, smashing, a broken man with a broken instrument. My steadfastness warred with my instinct for self-preservation. I knew deep down that calling the police on someone clearly in mental distress was a perilous path, fraught with the risk of escalation, of making things worse. My guilt flared hot and immediate, but he was screaming. He was smashing a guitar into my door. And that, I realized with a profound clarity, was where I drew the line. This wasn't about neighborly annoyance anymore. This was about safety, my safety, everyone's safety. My fingers trembled as I dialed 911. My voice was tight, thin, barely a whisper. "There's a man, my neighbor. He's in the hallway. He's threatening suicide. He's smashing things, a guitar, into people's doors." The dispatcher was calm, reassuring, asking for my address, his name if I knew it. I gave them what I could, my eyes darting towards my peephole, terrified he might look in and see me. The sounds outside intensified, a crescendo of smashing and screaming before suddenly, abruptly fading. Within minutes, the sirens wailed, echoing eerily through the downtown streets. Blue and red lights pulsed through my window, painting the apartment in frantic, shifting hues. I heard heavy footsteps, urgent voices, the clink of metal. Then Marcus's voice, raised in a desperate, broken cry, followed by the calmer, authoritative tones of the police officers. I heard shuffling, the scrape of something heavy being dragged, and then the distinct clang of an ambulance door. The sirens intensified for a moment, then began to recede, fading into the distance. Silence descended again, heavy and ominous. I spent the rest of the night huddled on my sofa, sleep impossible, the scent of fear still clinging to the air in my apartment. The guilt was a physical weight in my chest. Had I done the right thing? Had I pushed him over the edge? Was there another way? The questions circled endlessly in my mind, a relentless torment. The next morning, pale and exhausted, I went to speak with Ms. Albright, the building manager. She was a stern woman, efficient but often detached, more concerned with ledger books than the human dramas unfolding in her building. She listened to my account, her lips a thin line. "Yes, Miss Thorne, we've had issues with Mr. Hayes before." She used his last name, making him sound like a case file. "Smoking inside, for one, and..." She sighed, rubbing her temples. "He's been taping cigarette butts to people's doors and pinning knives into the walls." My jaw dropped. Knives? I hadn't known. This was far beyond loud music and spilled chili. This was terrifying. "Why wasn't anything done?" I asked, my voice barely audible. She shrugged, a dismissive gesture. "Nobody else was willing to report him, Miss Thorne. People are afraid. And with COVID by then, evictions were nearly impossible. It's a mess, believe me." Her words were a cold slap. Nobody else was willing to report him? The implication was clear. It was my fault for waiting, and now my fault for calling the police. My guilt, already a crushing burden, deepened, twisting into a bitter resentment towards the system, towards the manager's apathy. This wasn't just about Marcus anymore. It was about negligence. It was about the failure of those in power to provide a safe environment, to address obvious distress signals, to offer alternatives beyond calling the police on a mentally unwell man. This was the moment my role as the silent observer began to shift, to morph into something more purposeful, more driven. I would not be silent about the systemic failures that had allowed this tragedy to fester. The building continued its uneasy quiet for a few days, punctuated only by my own heightened senses, every shadow, every sound scrutinized. The manager's revelations had painted a far grimmer picture of Marcus and of the building's management. I walked the halls with a new, unsettling awareness, my eyes scanning the walls for invisible marks, my nose sniffing for faint traces of smoke. My steadfastness, once applied to enduring minor annoyances, now channeled into a quiet, simmering determination to expose the apathy I had witnessed. Then one night the crashing started again. It wasn't the violent, uncontrolled smashing of the previous episode, but a series of heavy thuds, interspersed with scraping noises. It sounded like furniture. I waited, holding my breath until the sound ceased. My heart pounded, but curiosity, and a growing sense of dread, spurred me to investigate. I pulled open my door a crack and peered out. The third-floor stairwell, normally clear and unencumbered, was now a grotesque obstacle course. Chairs, a small table, what looked like a shattered lamp, and even a tattered armchair were strewn haphazardly down the concrete steps. It was the fire exit. The one Mr. Pull the fire alarm in the night had just rendered impassable. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just harassment or self-harm. This was a direct endangerment of every person in the building. A blocked fire exit in an old building could mean catastrophe. I went straight back to Ms. Albright the next morning, my voice tight with controlled fury. "He's blocked the fire exit," I stated, my words clipped and precise, devoid of emotion. I showed her a photo I had taken discreetly. She actually looked startled, a flicker of genuine concern crossing her face. "He did what?" Her voice was sharp. This was a violation that even her bureaucratic indifference couldn't ignore. This was a liability, a legal nightmare. "That's it," she declared, her eyes narrowing. "That's the last straw. He's getting an eviction notice." Immediately, a wave of something akin to relief washed over me. An eviction notice. Finally, the end was in sight, but even as the relief settled, a new unease bubbled up. What would happen to Marcus? Where would he go? My guilt, it seemed, was a relentless companion, always finding new corners of my mind to inhabit. I knew I needed to maintain my composure to stay strong, but the situation was taking a profound psychological toll. My sleep was fractured, riddled with nightmares of wailing guitars and blazing stairwells. My concentration at work suffered, every quiet moment filled with the hum of unspoken anxiety. I felt trapped, not just in my apartment, but in a horrific narrative I couldn't escape. The eviction notice was delivered, I was told, hand to hand by a security guard. I imagined Marcus's reaction, another explosion of rage, another round of smashing. But instead, a strange, unnerving silence descended upon the third floor. Days turned into a week into two. Marcus's door remained closed. No music, no screaming, no new messes in the hall. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. I found myself walking past his door on my way to work, a faint curiosity mingling with the gnawing fear. Was he gone? Had he actually moved out? The silence was a relief, but also deeply unsettling. It felt too easy, too sudden. Then one afternoon I came home to a flurry of activity on the third floor. Two maintenance workers, neither of whom were Frank, were methodically clearing out Marcus's apartment. They were dismantling his bed, stacking boxes, and most tellingly, wheeling out expensive-looking guitar cases, amplifiers, and recording equipment on a dolly. My heart gave a strange lurch. He had left all his gear behind. Expensive stuff. Why would a musician just abandon his tools of the trade? I stopped, my observant nature compelling me to ask. "Is he moving?" I asked one of the workers, trying to keep my voice casual. The man grunted, wiping sweat from his brow. "Nah, he just vanished. Building staff waited nearly a month. He never came back. Guess he decided he didn't want this stuff no more." The words hung in the air, heavy and chilling. He just vanished. My mind reeled. Where had he gone? Had he actually found somewhere else to live? Or, the darker thought, the one I had instinctively pushed away, now surged forward with undeniable force. My guess, and it was a terrible, cold certainty, was that the poor bastard had probably punched his own ticket. He had been screaming about it, after all, in that final, terrifying outburst. The image of him, alone, desperate, broken, haunted me. It was super messed up. On one hand, it was a tragedy, incredibly sad. He deserved support, a system that had more options than just calling the police on someone in crisis. He deserved empathy, help, a chance at stability. On the other hand, I couldn't ignore what he had done. I wasn't going to sit by and say nothing while someone literally endangered and harassed his neighbors, especially if his only complaints were, "Why can't I keep smoking in the house and playing concert volume guitar in the middle of the night?" The dissonance was agonizing. The guilt that had plagued me since the very first time I'd knocked on his door now consumed me, an inferno of regret and sorrow. This was my rock bottom. My apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a tomb of unanswered questions and profound complicity. I had called the police. I had pushed for the eviction. And now he was gone, likely dead. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was deafening, echoing with the unspoken despair of a life extinguished. a system that had failed, and my own perceived failures. The outrage at the situation, the helplessness I felt in the face of such a profound tragedy, morphed into a cold, hard anger. Not at Marcus, but at the apathy, the negligence, the sheer lack of care from those in power. This was a systemic failure, and I, Vivian Thorne, the silent observer, now riddled with guilt, realized I could no longer stand by. I had to expose this. This was my new mission. My steadfastness had found its true purpose. And if you're finding this story compelling, remember there are many more like it. Subscribe to Neighbours From Hell channel for new Neighbours From Hell stories daily. The rock bottom I hit after Marcus's disappearance wasn't a sudden crash, but a slow, agonizing descent. The silence in the hallway, once a longed-for peace, now felt like a shroud. Every time I passed his empty apartment, I saw not just a vacant door but a gaping wound, a void where a troubled life had once raged. The guilt gnawed at me, a relentless acid. Had I done enough? Could I have done more? Had my call to the police sealed his fate? The what-ifs were a torment, a constant whisper in the quiet of my apartment. But my guilt, profound as it was, slowly began to transmute. It shifted from a paralyzing sorrow into a cold, unwavering determination. The apathy Ms. Albright had shown, her casual dismissal of his dangerous behaviors, her justification that nobody else was willing to report him, it solidified into a conviction that the problem wasn't just Marcus, but the system that had allowed him to deteriorate, unchecked and unhelped, until his problems endangered everyone. My role as the silent observer was over. My steadfast nature demanded action. I now sought systemic retribution against negligence. My goal was not revenge on a dead man, but justice for a failed system. I would expose the apathy of those in power. My transformation was quiet, internal, yet absolute. I became an architect of information, a meticulous researcher. My quiet job in data analysis, which had trained me in precision and the relentless pursuit of facts, suddenly felt like preparation for this moment. I spent every spare moment, late into the night, hunched over my laptop, fueled by strong black coffee and an unyielding sense of purpose. My first step was to understand the labyrinthine world of tenant rights and building management responsibilities in Louisville. I delved into city ordinances, housing codes, and public health regulations. I learned about proper fire safety protocols, mental health crisis intervention services, and the legal obligations of landlords to maintain a safe and habitable environment. My previous meticulous documentation, the notebook filled with dates, times, descriptions of incidents, the discrete photos of the chilly smears, the furniture in the stairwell, became my irrefutable evidence. I transcribed phone calls, logged every interaction with Ms. Albright, and compiled a comprehensive timeline of Marcus's escalating behavior and the building's insufficient response. It was a dossier of failure. My plan unfolded in phases, each one building on the last, designed to exert maximum pressure. Phase 1, the official complaint. I drafted a formal complaint to the Louisville Metro Housing Authority. This wasn't a petty grievance, it was a detailed indictment. I laid out every violation: the persistent noise disturbances that violated peace and quiet clauses, the unsanitary conditions from food throwing, the clear fire safety hazard created by the blocked stairwell, the repeated false fire alarms that disrupted the entire building, and most importantly, the building management's documented inaction and cavalier attitude towards these severe issues, particularly concerning Marcus's obvious mental health crisis. I used precise language, quoting specific regulations where possible. I attached my timestamp photos and offered to provide audio recordings if needed. The letter was formal, objective, and devastating in its compilation of facts. I ensured it focused on the building's negligence, not on Marcus's personal tragedy, framing it as a failure of oversight that jeopardized the safety and well-being of all tenants. I mailed it via certified mail, a small, grim satisfaction settling in my chest as I dropped the envelope into the slot. The waiting game began. Phase 2, the media outreach. I knew a bureaucratic complaint might get lost in the shuffle or be addressed quietly. My motivation was to expose the apathy, to shine a spotlight on the systemic failures. For that, I needed the media. I researched local investigative journalists known for community issues and tenant rights stories. I meticulously crafted an email, concise yet compelling, outlining the gravity of the situation without revealing too many details up front, hoping to pique their interest. I presented it as a story about a building management company's negligence and the potential public safety risks it posed, hinting at a tragic outcome for one of the residents. I attached a carefully curated selection of my photos, enough to show the severity of the issues without overwhelming them. Sending that email was terrifying. It felt like stepping out from behind my silent observer shield, but the profound guilt, mixed with my steady conviction, pushed me forward. I needed this story to be told not just for Marcus, but for every tenant in every building who felt unheard and unsafe. Phase 3, quiet community engagement. I wouldn't openly organize a tenant revolt, that wasn't my style. But I began to subtly, casually engage with other residents. Nod to Frank, the maintenance man, a quiet "it's better now, isn't it?" followed by a meaningful look. Casual conversations in the laundry room or by the mailboxes, letting others share their frustrations about the past issues, gently steering them towards the idea that the building management had let things get out of hand. I didn't directly recruit them, but I planted seeds of shared frustration and the possibility of collective action should the need arise. The first response came from the housing authority. A formal letter confirming receipt of my complaint, stating that an investigation had been initiated. It was a small victory, a tiny crack in the wall of indifference. Then a few weeks later my phone rang, an unfamiliar number. It was Melanie Carter, an investigative reporter from a local news station. "Ms. Thorne," she began, her voice crisp and professional, "I received your email. It's compelling, I'd like to hear more." My heart hammered against my ribs, but my voice remained steady. "Of course, Ms. Carter. I believe this story is about more than just a troublesome tenant. It's about accountability." We met for coffee, a neutral ground. I laid out my entire dossier, the dates, the specific incidents, the manager's dismissive responses, the blocked fire exit, the chilling quiet after Marcus's disappearance. I explained my motivation, not to sensationalize a tragedy, but to highlight a systemic failure, a pattern of apathy that endangered lives. I emphasized the need for better protocols, for actual support for tenants in crisis, for stricter enforcement of safety regulations. She listened intently, scribbling notes, her expression growing increasingly serious. She promised to look into it, to dig deeper. The housing authority investigation progressed, slow but relentless. I received calls, providing more details, answering follow-up questions. I learned that they were conducting an on-site inspection, interviewing other tenants, a few of whom, emboldened by my initial complaint, had come forward. The pressure was mounting on the building management. Then the local news story broke. It wasn't just a brief segment, it was a multi-part investigative report spanning several evenings. Melanie Carter's voice was calm, yet powerful, narrating the story with a gravitas that sent shivers down my spine. They showed photos of the stained walls, my photos, talked about the fire alarms, the blocked stairwell. They highlighted the manager's reluctance to act until faced with a severe liability. They even interviewed other tenants whose anonymous voices echoed my own frustrations and fears. My name wasn't explicitly mentioned, preserving my relative anonymity, but the narrative was unequivocally mine. The public outcry was immediate. Social media buzzed. Local advocacy groups weighed in. The building management company, a large corporate entity, was suddenly under intense scrutiny. There were calls for Ms. Albright's resignation, demands for thorough inspections of all their properties. And then came the grand payoff, the most devastating revelation, tied intimately to the twist that validated my long-held guilt and crystallized my motivation. The Housing Authority's official report, released to the public after the news story aired, contained a chilling detail. As part of their comprehensive investigation prompted by my detailed complaint, they had discovered that Marcus, Mr. Hayes, had indeed died by suicide. His body had been found in an abandoned warehouse across town a week after he vanished from the building. The equipment he left behind, the expensive stuff, had been family heirlooms he couldn't bring himself to sell, even in his desperation. But the most damning part of the report was the systemic failure it exposed. The building management had been aware of Marcus's long-standing, severe mental health issues, documented in previous complaints from family members and even a prior, less severe police interaction months before I moved in. They had failed to follow established protocols for tenants with known mental health crises, protocols that required direct communication with specific mental health support agencies and immediate intervention pathways. They had suppressed information, delayed necessary interventions, and actively avoided engaging with these agencies, fearing the paperwork or the potential trouble it would bring. Ms. Albright specifically was cited for gross negligence and willful disregard for tenant safety and well-being. Justice was served, in a bitter, complex way. The building management company faced substantial fines and was forced to implement new, stringent protocols for tenant complaints, mental health crises, and safety violations. Ms. Albright was quietly, unceremoniously dismissed from her position. Her casual apathy had finally cost her everything. The immediate consequences for the building were palpable. A new, more compassionate manager was appointed. Rules were enforced, but with a human touch. The hallways were consistently clean. The peace returned, a true, profound peace that felt more precious because of the storm that had preceded it. My apartment was a sanctuary once more, but it was a sanctuary built on the foundations of a tragedy I could never truly forget. My emotional journey ended not with simple triumph, but with a complex mix of relief, satisfaction, and a lingering sorrow. I had achieved my goal, I had exposed the apathy of those in power. Marcus's death was still a tragedy, one I carried a quiet guilt for, but now I knew that my actions, though painful, had ultimately forced a necessary change. I was no longer just a silent observer, I was a catalyst. And as I looked out over the quiet, well-maintained building, a new chapter began, one where the whispers of the past served as a reminder of the vigilance required to keep the darkness at bay. Subscribe to Neighbours from Hell channel for new Neighbours from Hell stories daily.